Hi, and welcome to this special episode of the Optometric Insights show. This is our 1 year anniversary. Both Dave and I have had the opportunity to really interview some of the brightest minds, some of the greatest spirits in eye care, and we're here today to share some of those highlights. You know, one of the toughest things that we had was we had difficulties going through all of the episodes and picking out our favorites, which we couldn't because every single one of the episodes were favorites for different reasons. So what we did was we decided to put together just a little bit of a highlight reel over the last year on some of those finer points, starting with episode number 2. This was the first episode that Dave actually interviewed somebody on his own. The first episode was where Dave and I actually kind of came together and shared with you, our audience, really the purpose of the Optometric Insights show. But this second episode, he talked to Dr. Glazer, and he really talked to him about creating the largest OD community. OD's on Facebook and now fluorescein. So take a listen to a few of the highlights from their episode, and I think you'll just grab a few real neat pearls.
Which I wanted to do Optometry's first TV show. That's really what we're working towards. And I told him, and like within seconds, you know, I said, I know he's really creative. I'm like, help me come up with a name. He goes, how about the Flora scene? You know, going to be like a scene. I'm like, oh my God. I like, that's it, right? It was just it. So, we also, you know, part of the thing with expanding efforts outside of Facebook is my community is called ODs on Facebook, and that's a trademarked word. I can't really use it outside of there. So I'm not rebranding that. That group will continue to be ODs on Facebook, but around it, we're putting this scene of social media that we have our Instagram page with around 3,000 people, and we have a LinkedIn group that's pretty active with 6,000 people, and a blog and a website and this and that, and an email newsletter. So this is the scene for optometry that we're creating, you know, expanding our social media presence out of.
It was great to hear Dr. Glazer's perspective on this, and it really is something where you just get this appreciation that he thinks about things differently. Again, from ODs on Facebook to fluorescein, this show that he created, and he really kind of, for the first time, he brought optometry together in a forum that really didn't exist. I mean, he was kind of the first on this platform that brought a group of us together, which was unbelievable. So, you know, Dave had another interesting interview in episode 23 where he talked to Dr. Elise Kramer. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Dr. Kramer, she actually she has a specialty practice in Florida, but the way she built it was pretty unreal. And she's, relatively speaking, a young practitioner. But here you'll hear a few highlights on how she actually did that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it didn't happen overnight. I would say it's kind of a non-traditional path that you would normally expect from, you know, an optometrist, I guess, a regular, just standard optometrist. So basically what I did is I went to the University of Montreal. I studied in French over there. And then when I was doing one of my externships here in South Florida, I applied for residency. I wanted to try living in Florida for personal reasons, and I decided to pursue a residency. I wanted to learn more. The island of Montreal, you know, a lot of people are extremely healthy, so I didn't really see much pathology when I was there. I had a lot of contact lens experience, you know, with keratoconus and corneal transplants because we had like a high level of contact lens at school. But unfortunately, I felt like I was lacking a little bit in ocular disease. And so I wanted to do a residency in that. And so I applied to the Miami VA, which is a joint program with Bascom Palmer Eye Institute, in which you kind of spend time at both places. And that's the residency I pursued. And while I was there, I actually got to spend a lot of time with a cornea specialist and did a lot of specialty lenses. And she is actually a huge researcher in dry eye as well. So I got to see a lot of very interesting cases and work more and more with contact lenses. And I decided just right after residency to start my own practice. I was filling in at different places, just to kind of build up the revenue on the side. But my goal was to have a full-time, private practice.
It's interesting and inspiring to hear Elise's story and really to hear how she's built this specialty lens practice. I think for the young practitioner, the students, I think it's highly motivational to hear that perspective. One of the other things that I'm always interested in are the facets and how quickly optometry seems to be evolving. We see that with scope of practice from a pharmaceutical perspective, from having access to oral medications, and now surgical privileges. And there are different places and pockets in the country where you have more or less surgical privileges. In episode 26, I interviewed Dr. McGee, and we actually talk about the cosmetic side of optometry because it has really changed the way that we're starting to communicate with our patients, not only from a surgical perspective, really some of the procedures that are being performed in contemporary eye care practices, but also to some of the new pharmaceuticals. Let's listen to that interview and take a few short clips from there.
I'll start with what I offer in my practice, and then I'll walk you through why I do it that way. So we do neurotoxins. So I've been doing that for, probably close to 4 to 5 years at this point now. And then I also have radiofrequency, which is a device that we use for skin tightening. And then of course, intense pulse light, which we all have heard, a lot about, and just very recently in the dry eye disease space, right? Yeah. And I do have a dry eye center of excellence that was born out of just treating my primary care patients. And it's amazing the knowledge that we all have and walk around with that we don't even realize that we really have as optometrists. So, one of the easy things to talk about is cosmetic ingredients, right? Because that piece, and a lot of people aren't comfortable talking about makeup or cleansers, or the fact that, when you look at the guidelines of what the US does as far as the FDA and what they approve, they ban 11 ingredients, whereas in Europe they ban about 1,500 ingredients.
Wow.
Yes. And when I tell patients that, they're just blown away, and they're like, well, wait a minute, but I spent a lot of money on this product that I love. And in fact,
Selena, can I stop you just for a second? So just to make sure that we're clear, because again, you're going to be more familiar with cosmetics than I am. So there's then products that you can get here in the US because the lack of bans on them, but you wouldn't be able to sell that product in Europe because the contents of that makeup just wouldn't be allowed to be sold there. Is that, that's a correct statement? Wow.
That is a correct statement.
Wow.
And the FDA hasn't touched the Cosmetic Act since 1938. So you're allowed.
Do you think we've learned anything since 1938, or
just a few things, right? And so there's so many things that our patients are utilizing that is either causing dry eye disease and upsetting homeostasis on the front surface, or sabotaging our best intentions when we're treating our patients. And so it's super important for us to be comfortable talking about those types of things, because they're not getting that information from, the Instagram person that's getting paid on the other side to talk about the product, right?
Right.
So that piece is a very easy way to dip your toe into cosmetics, and the reality is we all fit contact lenses. Most of us have an optical. So those two pieces are in fact cosmetic. I mean, a lot of our patients want to change the way they look, whether it's with new glasses or because they don't like the way they look in glasses, they want to wear contact lenses. So we're already in this space. I'm just building on it and expanding.
So as you can see, Dr. McGee is highly progressive in terms of the way that she practices and the procedures that she's performing in her practices. It's absolutely remarkable. And again, when you see the broad spectrum of the way that optometry can happen, it's pretty remarkable. So much so that Dave actually decided to interview Dr. Howard Purcell, who's the current president of the New England College of Optometry. And really, he wanted to focus on disruptive technologies. We see that the optometric profession is changing fast. And Dr. Purcell, for those of you that don't know his background, again, he had a long-standing background in in industry, and now he's the president of New England College of Optometry, and he's always really forged this relationship between the profession and companies in the industries that create the technologies that we're using on a daily basis. Let's listen to a few highlights from that episode.
Last part of the story I'll just share because it's a special story for me. I'm in Paris, and I see the phone ring. Working with Essilor in Paris, or French company.
Essilor's in Paris. Yep.
Exactly. And I see the phone ring, so I walk outside, and I'm literally, Dave, looking at the Eiffel Tower. Yeah. Eiffel Tower right in front of me, and I hear someone say something to my ear that I never expected to hear. And we'd like you to be the 13th president of New England College of Optometry. It was emotional for me. My dad passed away a couple of years ago, and so I know that he would have been very proud. But I could not be any more proud to represent my institution. And let me tell you, and you know this, the future of this profession is in great hands. Say what you will about optometry, et cetera. I get to spend my entire days. If any of your listeners ever have a bad day and want to brighten themselves up a little bit about optometry, spend a day with people that this is their dream. It's what they've wanted their whole life. They're reaching the pinnacle of it. And they get me fired up every single day. And it doesn't take a lot to get me fired up, but they get me fired up every single day. I feel like I was meant to be here. I was meant to be here during this time. I don't bring everything. I don't bring that long history of academia, but I have an incredible dean, Eric Weisberg, who's been part of NECO since he graduated. He knows everything about the academic world. He's a great dean, doing a fantastic job. And I feel like between the two of us, the experience he brings to the table and perhaps the outward experience that I've had, I would like to think is going to be a positive thing for the college.
It is remarkable to hear his energy. I mean, he's constantly thinking, and he's so tremendously passionate about the profession. You can just hear it in the tone of his voice as he kind of shares with Dave his ideas and thoughts on the profession and really where it's evolving. It is remarkable when you look at optometry and you look at how much we've been involved in some of the new technologies, not only using those technologies, but on the ground floor creating them. There are now optometrists that are research scientists for a lot of the major manufacturers that are bringing these technologies to market. We actually had a really interesting interview in episode 41 with Dr. Jason Jedlicka. He actually created a scleral lens, and he shares with us that journey, that innovative journey, the fact that he saw something where there was a void and he wanted to create or fill that void with a certain type of design. And he's going to share with us a little bit of that. And here's just a few highlights from the interview that Dave and I had with Dr. Jedlicka about this scleral lens that he created.
So again, I mean, this is just at the time when we did this, there was a trend towards scleral lenses in general were running around 16.5 millimeters was kind of the latest vibe for sclerals. And so, one of my thoughts was, probably want a couple different diameters because people have different size corneas, et cetera, et cetera. But I didn't want to just have unlimited diameter choices because when you start tweaking diameter, lots of things change. And I thought that would add to some unpredictability of the lens. So trying to keep the diameter options to a minimum and instead put in a fitting set, a series of lenses that would cover both the steep and the flat cornea. Because at the time, we would fit a cone patient, I would pull one fitting lens. I'd have somebody else come in who was post-LASIK, I have to pull a different fitting set because they don't both work on the same patient. So a lot of it was just really the idea that I would get people come up to me at conferences and say, hey, what's the best sclera lens? I want to get started doing these things. And which one would you recommend? I'd say, well, I got to tell you, it depends on the type of eye I'm working on. Because I got 3 favorite sets and it just depends on what type of patient. And that was like a revelation that it seems like we should be able to make a set that has it all in one set, And so, I mean, that was kind of the goal at the time, was to create a lens that would cover the full spectrum. So if I just have one fitting set, I can fit a post-LASIK eye, I can fit a graft, I can fit a cone, I can fit anybody with just this one set.
I mean, how cool is that? I mean, he was on the forefront of innovation. He always has been when it comes to contact lenses, but a lot of it was in the realm of clinical care. He's now actually in academia teaching the next generation of students. But to hear his story and how that came about with designing that sclera lens is motivating to say the least. In that same vein, and keeping on this theme of technology, we know that there's a lot that's happening, and there's no better person to discuss new technologies, in particular when it comes to corneal care, than Dr. John Gellis. He's actually interviewed in episode 46, and we talked specifically about early keratoconus diagnosis. And again, I don't think there's a better person to discuss this topic than he, because he has not only been involved in utilizing a lot of these technologies in his clinical practice to catch these individuals and to identify them, but he's also been on the ground floor and actually helping guide the progression of these technologies. So here we're going to just take a snippet from that episode 46, and where we hear John kind of talking about that.
There's so many technologies, and like if we just use them in a way where we pay attention to the data that's coming out of them, many of these technologies are already in your practice, right? The big one that I'm hugely pro on is any sort of tomography, whether that comes from a shine plug camera or from an OCT, an anterior segment OCT. And the ability to look at anterior surface elevation, posterior surface elevation, and corneal, global corneal thickness is extremely important to the diagnosis of the disease. And then when you go specifically to OCT, you can look at layer thickness of the cornea, and typically the epithelial layer thickness, which in keratoconus is going to create kind of a donut pattern. You're going to have this epithelial thinning over the apex and heaping around the base of it. These technologies are just, you can catch things so early, and many of us have corneal or rather posterior segment OCTs that have an anterior segment function on them, and just using that to be able to screen these sorts of corneas where things are a little irregular. Now the disconnect though is when do you use these devices, right? Like, it's one thing for me to say you have a tomographer, use it on everybody. That's just not realistic. So it kind of comes down to what are the signs that should trigger you to say, oh, I should get a corneal topography at very least on this individual, because like right now, if we look at like tomography, for instance, very few optometrists have corneal tomography available to them. So, knowing when to say, okay, well, this is suspicious is the big key on a lot of this.
It is remarkable to hear the potential role that we as optometrists have in the future longevity of the health of an individual's cornea. And it really all revolves around catching these patients sooner and providing them appropriate treatment and appropriate care. But at some point, there may require specialty lens care in these individuals. And that's actually where we pull our next guest. It's actually episode 49. We talked to Dr. Maria Walker, and we talk about post-lens tear fogging. And she does research on this. She'll literally take contents of the post-lens tear reservoir and actually sample it to determine what's in and what's not in that post-lens tear reservoir. And here she gives us some fascinating insights into what she's actually looked at and how that can help us fit these patients with these irregular corneas in a better, more efficient way, understanding more about the composition of that fluid in the post-lens tear film.
Anyone who's heard me speak probably knows I have a special place in my heart for those patients who experience midday fogging. So I've looked, and I think the last time I talked a lot about the lipids that we found, so we've looked at the lipids, we've looked at the proteins, and now we've actually looked at cells as well. And so probably the most exciting new findings that we have is that we've confirmed, there was actually a study in 2019 that looked and found that there was neutrophils in the fluid reservoir, so that gets trapped there. So neutrophils are as you know, the most abundant immune cell really in the body.
Maria, so just to break that down a little bit. So you're looking at scleral lens wearers that are those foggers. And again, we know we have those foggers, we have those non-foggers. So you're looking at the ones where that fluid is physically foggy, and we see that on OCT, we see that at slit lamp. And now you're analyzing those patients and asking what's different about these people, correct?
Yes, exactly. So we have patients who don't have fogging, because you always want to have some sort of control so you can see if it's not there. And if you look at those and compare those to the patients with fogging, that's what we do. So I think last time we talked about the lipids. And so we found that the balance of basically there's a lot of free fatty acid lipid types of things. So things that are very hydrophobic. And we also found specifically that the ratio, and this was something I don't think we had known last time, the ratio of unsaturated to saturated lipids is actually increased. And so that was a super interesting finding, because one thing that you definitely know, and I know from clinic, is that we tend to see it more in our dry eye patients.
She does such a great job, and she is so hyper-focused, her research on scleral lens wearers and making that experience better. And you can get a sense of that even when we interview her regarding the research. Again, it's so important to understand that, and it's part of the reason why we pull these guests on our show. In that same vein, as we look at how optometry is evolving, we're not only taking care of patients' eyes, but at this point, we're really educating them, and we're giving them guidance on more systemic conditions, the number of things that we can actually catch during the eye exam, the number of things that we're exposed to that maybe their physicians aren't exposed to, and we can give better insights to their physicians, and we can partner with those physicians for those clinical conditions that patients are currently undergoing care with. It's actually one of the reasons why we interviewed Dr. Paul Chaus in episode 57, and we talked all about diabetic eye care. Now, Paul is an interesting guy for part of the reason that he's so passionate about diabetic eye care is that he in fact is a diabetic individual, but his breadth of knowledge around diabetes, diabetic eye care for patients with diabetes is second to none. And here we're going to pick his brain a little bit in episode 57, and you'll hear his perspective on HbA1c and really what it actually means to control glucose levels and what that means for the long-term outcome for patients.
So what I tell my colleagues in optometry now, but also my patients, is that it doesn't really matter what your hemoglobin A1c is today. It matters what it's been since you were first diagnosed with diabetes. A lot of patients aren't diagnosed till they've had diabetes more than 6 years based on the number of beta cells in the pancreas that are still functioning. So the average is 6.2 years at diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So, this whole notion of what's called the metabolic memory or the legacy effect, which basically means if you have great blood sugar control early on, even if it goes down the toilet as time goes by, your odds of getting severe damage to the eyes from diabetes are much lower than somebody who has lousy control the first 5 or 10 years and then suddenly gets fabulous control. So what I want to know from my patients is not just what your A1C is today, but what has it been historically. The other thing that's important to know is A1C has a lot of flaws with it. First of all, it's not really an average. It's related to somebody's average, but it's not truly the average. So it's been shown, and this has been published, that somebody with a hemoglobin A1C of 9% might actually have a better average blood glucose level than somebody whose A1C is 7%. So you can't hang your hat exclusively on A1C. There is a new marker that has emerged as a highly predictive for diabetic retinopathy, and that's called glucose time in range. So it's basically what percentage of any day, week, month, or year your blood sugar ranges between 70 and 180. You want to stay in that tight range as much as possible, because when you get outside of it, the risk for diabetic retinopathy, kidney disease, heart disease all goes up dramatically. The downside to time in range is you need a device that can measure your blood sugar all the time. And so it's typically patients on insulin therapy. And there's multiple devices out there now. Probably your audience has seen these on patients. Dexcom makes one, Medtronic makes one. There's one you wear on the upper arm called the Freestyle Libra. But these devices are wonderful because they calculate automatically for you your glucose time in range, and the number, because we all know 7% is good for A1C.
He does such a great job, and he's so passionate about the condition itself, and also monitoring and managing, and also optometry's role in this larger process as well too. I think that's critical, us understanding our bigger picture role in the general healthcare field. In that same vein, we're starting to question the way that we currently treat things. Dr. Dave actually interviewed Mitch Eibach on a new technology that's going through clinical trials right now that may change the way we care for our glaucoma patients. It's pretty remarkable how it's based around the pressure gradient. And in episode 65, he interviews him, and here's just a few highlights from that and how this technology will fundamentally differ from traditional pharmaceutical management, how it may potentially supplement it, but ultimately what makes it different, and how optometry may have a tremendous role in incorporating this technology.
If you think about us all being pressurized bodies where we have a thumb kind of pressing down on all of us, which is atmospheric pressure, if we can separate the front part of the eye from atmospheric pressure with a pair of goggles, just like a pair of swim goggles, those goggles are attached to a tubing. That tubing is attached to a pump that pulls out pressure or applies negative pressure, then you're lessening the amount of pressure pushing onto the cornea, which translates to less interocular pressure.
What has been done and shown in some studies since then, and how are you measuring pressure behind a goggle, and how does that all work?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting. Research was very new to me coming out of optometry school and residency. And then the research that I am fortunate to do is most commonly phase 2B or phase 3 FDA clinical trials, where all of the very early stuff has been done already.
Yeah.
And so this was really grassroots, from the ground up type of research, where we were just trying to figure out how we measure it. Can we measure it?
Yeah.
And so a lot of the data, unfortunately, I can't speak of because it's in FDA clinical trials right now. But what we've seen is patients do well with the goggles, and it's analogous to wearing a CPAP. And so the thought is patients will just wear this at night. If we can lower the pressure at night for 6 to 8 hours, hopefully that releases some of the imbalance between the optic nerve and the intracranial pressure and interocular pressure.
Yeah.
And then we have axonal flow. We have transport nutrients getting to the optic nerve. And then during the day, the pressure can go back up.
So you can see that the role optometry is going to play in managing glaucoma will change. It seems like we'll have a supplement to traditional pharmaceutical and surgical management options for these individuals. So we've had a wild year with the Optometric Insights show. This is our first year. Again, hopefully it was chock full of information that you extracted from it, had a chance to implement some of it in your clinical practice. Also, just as an FYI on some of the things that are going to be coming out in the future, and just hearing from great people and getting perspective on these episodes for the future. For 2022 and 23, we have an absolutely awesome slate of people that we have scheduled to interview, talk to, and really understand more about where the profession is, some of the highlights in innovation, and also where the profession's going in the future here. We hope that you have enjoyed this first year as much as we have. We promise to do as much as we can to continue to deliver the most up-to-date information to you as possible through the Optometric Insights show, through constantly recruiting the best minds in the profession. We thank you for your loyalty. We thank you for your listenership, and we really look forward to another great year with you. Make sure you're subscribing to the podcast. Make sure you're subscribing to our YouTube page, and make sure you're following us, and make sure you're getting any updates on our podcast. Thank you again for the first year, and we really look forward to seeing you and enjoying 2022 with leaders in the profession again with you.